Let's record. All right, so planning a pollinator garden. This is a talk that I started putting together just for building a pollinator garden, and we had so many folks who were interested in pollinators to really improve their vegetable garden. So I kind of tweaked it and amended it. This is usually a 2-hour talk, but I did cut it down, so there are places where we're not going to be able to get into the nitty-gritty, like of all of the different families of bees and details in that regard. But this is still, I think, going to be pretty useful and pretty good for most instances. So, to start off, what is a pollinator? Pollinators serve numerous purposes for us. Their most important purpose for plants is fertilizing flowers so that flowers can actually produce their seed for the next year. They also can produce diversity in the yard. A lot of our pollinators are aesthetically pleasing, especially the moths and the butterflies. Some of our pollinators, flies, wasps, are not something that you think of as an aesthetic and appealing option, but they can definitely be a good thing for our plants and for our biodiversity. Improving our biodiversity is always an important conversation to have. Monocultures are not going to be the best bet for a really good, healthy ecosystem in your backyard. Why is pollination important? Without pollinator visits, a lot of our fruit and vegetable plants are not going to produce. We might not have as much to eat. We'll still have some things like our leafy greens, but a lot of things that we eat the fruit of do require pollination in order to successfully complete their life cycle. 90% of all flowering plants do rely on animal pollinators for fertilization, and about 200,000 species of animals act as pollinators. So pollinators go far beyond the typical bee and butterfly that we usually think of. Making a yard that is pollinator friendly is going to do so many different things for you. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the aesthetics of a nice green lawn just as much as most. But personally, I think that the image on the right-hand side here is much more aesthetically appealing. It draws your attention, and it just gives your eye something to look at, something that changes through the season, something that is always a little different. A pollinator-friendly yard is going to improve the diversity in your yard, and it's going to be often a little bit more attractive than just your standard turf grass and maybe a non-flowering shrub hedge or something. So when you are planning your season, you want to make sure that you are providing a food source for your pollinators that is consistent. So you want to plan for a long season of bloom. The term for this is phenology. It's the influence of the seasons on plant growth. So you want to make sure that you have blooms as early in the season as possible and as late in the season as possible. That way you get good consistent food sources for your pollinators. If you have blooms just in one part of the season, pollinators aren't going to stick around. They might come in and they might run off again. But if they start to find that you have something for them to eat and something for them to use all season long, then you're much more likely to have a lot of success. There is a really good fact sheet from Utah State University that goes over the details of season of bloom, and most of the plants cross over for Colorado quite well. So that could be a good place to look. It actually shows you the bloom length and what pollinators, mostly focusing on bees, what bees go to particular flowers at what time. And of course, for pollinators, you want that flowering phase is the most important time of consideration when you're planning out your season of bloom. So that can be things as simple as the bulbs in the first picture, or having a blanket flower, or those asters or mums that bloom late in the season. Having a little bit of crossover with your blooms can be good. You don't have to get it perfect the first year. You can make this an experiment for the next 5 to 10 to the rest of your life. I mean, it's a long-term project that can work pretty well. So Gardens can be beautiful and they can provide good habitats. So like us, our pollinator friends need food, water, shelter, and space. And so all of these things are important to get to put together in how you're working with your pollinators, or how you're working to attract your pollinators. Incorporating native plants or native adapted plants, which is a term that Denver Botanic Gardens uses to kind of expand our plant palette a little bit. You can choose plants that grow natively in regions similar to ours around the world. It just gives us a little bit more choice. But for our native bees, native plants are maybe as much as 4 times more attractive to native bees than flowers that have come from somewhere else. That said, something is better than nothing. So find what you can that will give you a good long season of bloom, that will give you good diversity and good habitat for your natives, or for your pollinators. A lot of native plants or native adapted plants may be less susceptible to pests and diseases, which requires fewer inputs on your part. I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes some parts of me are lazy. I'm a lazy gardener, and so easier gardening is always a plus. This is just a quick little look at practice we call it IPM, Integrated Pest Management, where if you really kind of have things in balance, then you can keep your needs for inputs from you, such as pesticides or irrigation and that kind of thing, you can reduce those needs. So planning that out can be useful and important, and master gardeners can definitely help with suggestions for planning. We're not going to be able to plan your garden for you, but we can offer suggestions if you have an idea of what direction you want to go in. When you are planning your landscape, you want to group plants near each other. If you can connect your spaces of flowering plants together, it creates a nice line, a nice path for pollinators to follow. And so that's going to give you a good way for pollinators to go from your front yard, where you might have a few things working in your favor, to your backyard, where you might have a whole bunch more options. And generally speaking, that silly phrase, if you build it, they will come. If you start planting pollinator-friendly plants and build a pollinator-friendly yard, you will start to see more and more pollinators. They will find you, definitely find you. You do want to also think about planning your landscape host plants not only for the adults, but for the larvae. The most commonly known example for this, of course, is the milkweed and the monarch butterfly. Now, in Colorado, we aren't in the monarch migration pathway, but we do get some stragglers. So planting some milkweed is certainly fine. But a lot of larvae have different hosts than their adult form. And so if there's something particular you're trying to attract or trying to grow more of, do a little bit of research and find out what those plants might be. We do have a really good fact sheet on butterflies in the garden. And so possibly Eric can put that into the chat forum for us. Either a fact sheet or a garden note. My brain just went blank on which it is. But we have a really good sheet that gives you a list of a lot of the butterflies, especially that we have in Colorado, and what plants they are most benefited by. As you're looking at your landscape, I see this a lot. Folks move into a brand new home and they want to just get gung-ho and excited straight away and start planting. I really strongly encourage watching your yard for a season, or for a full year of seasons, just to see how the sun and shade moves and how your microclimate exists. The larger the area you can put into this, the better attractiveness you're going to be able to have. But I've seen success in the little strips between the sidewalk and the road. I've seen success in small garden beds. You're just not going to, like, the larger the space, the more likely you are to attract pollinators quickly. And if you do have a very shady yard, you're going to be more challenged to find good plants, because a lot of our native plants and our low water plants, they evolved in desert. They evolved in a low water environment where big trees and shade aren't really a big thing. So it can be a little bit more challenging that way. When you're thinking of your design, you want to incorporate variety, you want to group plants. For the purpose of pollinators, you can provide snags or bee hotels. Bee hotels have been very popular. Make sure that you are careful in finding plans for bee hotels because some of them aren't very good, actually very good for bees. There are a lot of good resources on that, if you send me an email afterwards, I can connect you up with a lot of good resources for building your own bee hotel. And they also need to be cleaned out every year, which a lot of people don't realize. The other thing is to make sure that you have some undisturbed and uncovered ground. A lot of our native bees nest in the ground on bare soil. And so if there's no bare space for them, then they're going to struggle with sticking around in your area. Plant in layers, like you can see in this on the picture on the left, where there's lower plants in the front, higher plants in the back. We have a picture-perfect example of what not to do at our fairgrounds. We have these tall grasses that surround shorter rose bushes in the center, and it's just not very aesthetically pleasing. So making sure that you kind of get some layers in there, have perennials and grasses and ground covers intermixed. Odd numbers tend to be more aesthetically pleasing. This is hard for me. I tend to like even numbers, but 3s, 5s, and 7s are going to be a lot more aesthetically pleasing. Make sure that you are providing water for your pollinators. The very best way to do this is like the picture on the right, a shallow dish with pebbles in it. But if you've got an irrigation line that drips a little bit and it's somewhere where it's okay, then you can leave that. And areas where butterflies can come in and do what we call puddling can be beneficial as well. Puddling is, like in this picture to the left, this is a way that butterflies have thought that they acquire some minerals and potentially a little bit of water. Many butterflies in their mature form do not actually ingest much in the way of water or food. They do a little bit, but not much. And so puddling is one way for them to get things that they need. A little bit more on bee hotels. I thought I'd left this slide in. They've become more popular lately. You should make sure that the holes are very smooth and that you're placing them in an open and protected area with early morning sun, but afternoon shade. All right, so why do bees visit flower? Mostly it's for food. Pollen provides them a protein, which they can make into a bee bread and feed to immature bees. The nectar provides them carbohydrates for quick energy. Honeybees and a few other bees will actually convert that into honey. Pollination is completely a byproduct for these animals. They are not sitting there thinking, ooh, I'm going to keep these flowers' lives going on. The flowers have evolved to tempt their pollinators to come in, take their nectar, and move on to another flower. So it's a symbiotic relationship, but neither participant is necessarily trying actively to benefit the other. The flower a little bit more so because I say they know as though they're conscious, but they do things to attract the pollinators for sure. So if you are trying to attract bees in your yard, there's a few things that are useful to know about bees. We have over 4,000 species of bees in the United States. They are one of the most efficient pollinators. They do purposefully collect pollen to bring back and produce bee bread. When you're thinking about looking for flowers to attract bees, make sure that you have flowers that are not sterile or not pollenless, more like the mums on the left-hand side in this picture, and less like the gorgeous dahlia on the right-hand side. A lot of those double flowers, like the knockout roses, their pollen and nectaries are not accessible to pollinators, or they have been completely bred out just for aesthetics, and they're sterile. So it's something just to keep in consideration as you're planning your garden. You can still definitely plant that gorgeous dahlia, just have something else to provide a food source for the pollinators. So some of the flowers that are most attractive to bees, a wide variety of colors from white to violet. They often will have more of a floral or herbal fragrance, and they will have usually an open shape, either that umbel shape on the bottom right, or an open daisy type, the legume bean or clover pea type flower. And usually these flowers are open during the daytime. Some flowers do close up every night, like a crocus closes up once that sun is gone. And because their main source of pollinator is the bee, which is active and alive and around during the day. So there's no point in them staying open at night. Like I said, if you plant it, they will come. Most bees will forage up to 2 miles away from their hive. That's for a honeybee. Natives will be a little bit closer to home, but can still travel long distances. You can do this on your own Google map. You can do a little circumference. This is where our office in Brighton, and I looked at, or I kind of just did a 2-mile radius all around, and it's quite a surprising distance of how far around it goes. We have some Russian hawthorns, excuse me, in one of our demonstration gardens that I swear every year the bees come from miles around, and they almost lift that tree away with how much they love those blooms. So it can be a really good thing to just kind of be aware of what's around you as you're planning, and that they will come to your yard because they're coming from a ways away. Generally speaking, perennials and woody plants are a little bit more favorable for bees than herbaceous plants. They provide a richer nectar, and they are a dependable source of food and nectar, or pollen and nectar, year after year. So I've got here pictured the Carol Mackie Daphne and a lead plant. Both are very good. One is a higher water, one is a very low water option, but those perennial flowering plants can be a really good choice, because the bees know from year to year that there's a good source of pollen in that area. Of course, honeybees and other pollinators love herbs, but you do have to let them go to flower. So your annuals, your basil and parsley, your dill and cilantro, you can, if it's gotten a little bit big and a little bit less flavorful, you can let that guy go to seed. Let it start to flower, and the pollinators will start to find it. For your perennials, if you're lucky and you have a sheltered area, you might be able to overwinter rosemary. Chives and oregano, thyme and sage are super popular with our pollinators. They can just get swarmed, and they're all really good choices for growing in our yards. So that way you can kind of get a dual benefit. You get some food for the pollinators, but you also get something for your own garden or for your own kitchen. So, generally speaking, as I said, there are 4,000 native bee species in the United States. Experts estimate there are over 20,000 in the world. Most of the natives in America are west of the Rockies. California has about 2,000, and there are about 900 species in Colorado. Generally speaking, they're very diverse in color, shape, size, and habit. There are some bees that are so small that they can fit on the eye of a honeybee. There's a subfamily called Megachilidae, which is the sweat bees, and they can be brilliantly green. We do have those here in Colorado, the bright green sweat bees. They're gorgeous. I took the picture out, so I'm describing it. So the bee families are grouped into 7 different families, 6 of which we have here in the US, and 5 of which are pretty common. And you don't have to remember, obviously, but the Coletidae, Adrenidae, Halictidae, and Megachilidae, and the Apidae. Apidae is the one that has honeybees and bumblebees, which are the bees that most people are familiar with. Honeybees, they pollinate about 25% of our food crops. They usually visit somewhere between 50 and 100 flowers per trip. Workers make about a 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey each over their lifetime. They don't live very long. The bees that overwinter are the longest lived of the entire year. All bees are raised from the same eggs. The way that queens develop is that they are fed royal jelly. Workers are infertile females, and drones are males that were unfertilized eggs. And there aren't nearly as many drones as the workers. So if you see honeybees out and about, tell her that she's doing a good job and she's working hard for her family. A quick little note about being stung. Number of times I'm out and about and I hear somebody saying, "Oh, a bee is chasing me, it wants to sting." If it's chasing you and it's trying to sting you, or it's stung you repeatedly, very, very unlikely it's a bee. Usually that's more likely to be a wasp. Wasps have a smooth stinger and they can sting repeatedly. Bees have barbs on their stinger, as you can see in this picture, and it actually eviscerates them when they sting you. So they think carefully before stinging. They will sting if you get close to their hive, if you start to threaten. Eric actually had an adventure with one of his hives this week, and they tried to check for the queen, and the hive got super pissed, and they're still angry today, apparently. So they can get pissed off and they can sting, but if you're just going out and about in your daily life, it's very unlikely that it's a bee that's doing the stinging. And of course, there are plenty of other pollinators. Moths and butterflies are super common pollinators. There's about 300 butterfly species and thousands of moth species that are well-known pollinators. They can be easily distinguished by their antennae. So if you take a look, you can't see it very well in this picture, but butterflies usually have a very slender antennae. Moths have this really thick antennae. Moths are usually nocturnal, and their antennae help them to kind of navigate a dark world. Attracting butterflies, windbreak plantings, or other shelter to reduce the wind. Butterflies are not super strong flyers, and so if you can give them somewhere that's a little bit more sheltered, you can do that really simply with a vining hedge, or if you've got a fence line, something like that will reduce the wind significantly. And like I talked about, that mud puddling for allowing them somewhere to get a little bit of minerals and some water. Beetles are actually another fairly common pollinator. There's over 30,000 species of beetles in the US. Of course, not all of those are active pollinators, but many do pollinate. They usually like flowers that are stronger scented, large flowers. Beetles aren't terribly efficient at pollinating, and they don't always go from the same species to the same species. And sometimes they can do damage as well. So finding a good balance with our beetles as pollinators is important. Hummingbirds, one that people often do think of, are very good pollinators. In this picture, they're going to a thistle, but they often like flowers that are long and tube-shaped, usually reddish or orangish. This is why we dye traditionally have dyed the water in hummingbird feeders red as a way to attract them. Hummingbirds are a very good pollinator here in the Intermountain West, and you can definitely get them in your own yard. Don't make the mistake I did. I put a hummingbird feeder out all the way in my backyard where I've got just an open field. Couldn't get a hummingbird there to save my life. They like somewhere where they can kind of retreat to a tree, retreat to somewhere with a little bit of shelter. Flies are another really good pollinator. They do pollinate quite a bit. Not your typical housefly. They're hoverflies. Usually these are specifically, the flies are pretty common on specific flowers, but they do visit many different species. And wasps, of course, although they are awful, they also can be really good pollinators. They do have a long antennae, they have a chewing mouth part. The good way to distinguish them from a bee is that they usually are pretty much hairless. They have a very narrow waist, and they don't have any hairs to carry pollen. One of the wasps that you'll often see that is a very good pollinator is the paper wasp. The paper wasps are really good at pollinating. We've only had it in Colorado since 2001, but unfortunately, while they are very good pollinators, they also love caterpillars. This can be great for your vegetable garden. They can eliminate your cabbage loopers on any of your brassicas, but they also can be detrimental for your butterfly garden. I know Whitney Cranshaw, who's our state entomologist, said that he's seen a significant reduction in caterpillar species throughout Colorado since the introduction of the paper wasp. So the more we can plant, hopefully we can keep the caterpillars and the butterflies going so that they can outgrow kind of the pressure of the paper wasps. So I touched on this briefly, but pollinators often prefer different shapes of flowers. So open or bowl-shaped flowers, like a poppy or a potentilla, a buttercup, cup or shrub rose are going to be good choices. Lipped flowers can usually have, you can see here, right here, a landing pad where the bee can actually rest on there to gather its nectar, and the flower will then deposit the nectar onto the back of the bee. I'm sure many of you have seen the lovely pictures of the bumblebee butt that just kind of is sticking out of a flower, and they're usually covered in pollen as well. The open umbel type flowers in the carrot family are a very good source. This bottom picture is a moon carrot, which is quite a xeric flower. It does attract flies and it does attract wasps, as you can see in the picture, but it attracts bees and butterflies as well. It's pretty universally appealing. All right, so into the specifics for your vegetable garden. We'll kind of go into what good and bad choices are for your garden, what plants you need a pollinator, and how to ensure good pollination. And I'm going to pause for a moment and we can open up chat. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box.
I hadn't seen any yet, Cassie. So.
Okay. I will dive back in. I'm hopeful that I'm making good time so we can have a good little question and answer session at the end, because I did cut this talk down quite a bit. So if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat and we'll catch them as we can. All right, so pollinators for your vegetable garden. A good variety of pollinator-friendly plants will benefit your vegetable garden. The more diversity you can bring into the garden, the better. I mean, this is true across all of our landscape discussions. If you can bring in diversity, you're going to have a much healthier ecosystem overall. What not to do in the vegetable garden when you are looking to attract pollinators. Spraying insecticides is going to be detrimental. Unfortunately, unlike in this comic, there is no such thing as a selective pesticide that only kills ugly bugs. So unfortunately, your options for pesticides are much more limited as you are trying to attract pollinators. There are some options. You can definitely get in touch with our office and we can help you out if you're having big problems. If you surround your entire garden with a mesh, you're not going to have any pollinators come in. And be cautious. Don't squash every insect you see. Almost every year we get questions about this strange little insect that looks like a creepy killer. It looks like a little tiny baby alligator, and it is the larva of a ladybug. And they look creepy, they look awful, but they are going to be far better for aphid control even than adult ladybugs. And so be aware of the insects as you're planning them out. Providing water for your vegetable garden is going to be one of the best things you can do. Here you can see some honeybees hanging out on a sprinkler head. They are getting water where they can. You want to make sure if you're putting water out that it is a shallow surface, that you're refilling it frequently. Refill it every 1 to 2 days so that you don't get other things like mosquito larvae building up in it. And you want it to be very shallow because a honeybee can drown in a very, very small amount of water. I don't know the number of times that I've accidentally left a bucket out, even for an hour or so, and I come back and there's a bee that has come in looking for a drink and drowned itself, unfortunately. So be careful as you're putting water out that you're doing in a good manner. You can let your garden plants go to seed. I do this with my lettuce accidentally. Most years it starts to bolt, and instead of pulling it out, if I'm not desperate to reuse the space for something else, I'll let it go to seed. I'll let it flower. Those flowers are really attractive to the pollinators. On the left-hand side, you can see what broccoli looks like as it's starting to go to seed as well. Plants that need pollinators, so anything in the melon family, the squash, zucchini, melons, pumpkins, they all need a pollinator. In the picture on the left-hand side, you can see this little bitty baby female. It was a female flower, right where the brown part was. and it did not get pollinated properly. You can see that it's kind of going a bit yellow. And it's going to start to shrivel up and drop off. What in the right-hand picture, this is what was one of my squash blossoms. There is actually a native bee called a squash bee, and they love to chill out in your squash blossoms. They will sleep in there overnight even. I've gone out there at like 6 o'clock in the morning before, and they're just hanging out there waiting to warm up enough so that they can fly off to the next flower. But they are going to really be beneficial, or they are going to be a very good pollinator source for your melon crops, your cucurbits. Cucumbers are another one. Do be aware, as you're encouraging this cross-pollination, these are not plants that you can save for seed. They are pretty promiscuous. A pumpkin will cross-pollinate successfully with a cucumber, and the seeds that you save from that cross-pollination are not going to produce something that is super tempting for you. Cucumbers. I had on a different slide. Cucumbers definitely will need cross-pollinators. If you don't have pollinators in your yard, you can fake this. You can take the male flower and peel all of the yellow leaves off. This is a female. You can peel all of those yellow leaves off, leaving just the stamens and the pistils, and then you can dip that into all of your female flowers. You can act as your very own pollinator. So if you're not getting good fruit set, if all of your fruits are starting to look like this little yellow shriveled cucumber in the back, then that could be something that's worth doing until your pollinators start to really increase in number over time. And so that can be a good way to kind of fake the pollinator until you get them coming into your area. Melons and watermelons also need pollination. Tomatoes. Tomatoes can be pollinated by hand, and they can be pollinated by wind. Most of our pollinators are not actually heavy enough to successfully pollinate our tomato flowers. So bumblebees are a pretty good one for this. They will actually vibrate that pollen right out of the flower. But you can pollinate them yourself as well with a toothbrush, or not a toothbrush, with a paintbrush, or some kind of like sponge. I've put a sponge on the end of a stick before and kind of jostle in that flower and make it go. Usually though, if you've got a good enough amount of flowers in your yard and you've got some pollinators in your yard, you're going to be pretty safe and secure making sure that you pollinate, or that you're getting pollination from somebody other than yourself. Eggplants also are by hand or by wind. In this picture you can see that paintbrush. So you would dip that paintbrush deep into that flower and then into the next flower. You do want to make sure that you circle back to that first flower before the end of hand pollinating. But hopefully you're getting enough pollinators into your space that you don't have much of a problem. Peppers, both hot and sweet. I mean, these are all in the same family. They're all solanaceous. They're all going to need to be pollinated. They can be pollinated by hand as well. Wind can do some pollination for them, but they will need some kind of secondary pollination. And there are many others. Many plants require a pollinator if you do plan to save seed. So a lot of our crops, we harvest before they've actually gone through their full life cycle. If you think of carrots or beets or lettuce, onions, we're harvesting before they've finished their life cycle, so they didn't need a pollinator to get to the point where we are eating them. But if you are planning to save seed, then you will need to let them finish out their life cycle. Some of them are biennial. Carrots and onions will take a second year to get to that point of flowering. And so at that point, they would need a pollinator in order to help them set that seed and cross-pollinate, fertilize. There are a lot of different plants that are parthenocarpic. These varieties don't need to be pollinated. They don't produce a viable seed. And they're hybrids. They have been bred for the purpose of producing a fruit for us. The picture on the right, or the cucumber on the right here, is that versus the one on the left that does actually have a seed. These can be a good choice if you don't have much in the way of pollinators. But if you're trying to save seed, then you want to make sure you're not planting these hybrids because you're not going to get a seed from them. And plants that can survive to harvest without pollinators. Any of our leafy greens, like I said with that addendum, if you're not planning to save seed. Any of our brassicas, so the broccoli and cauliflower, the cabbage and kohlrabi, they do not need anything to get them to the point where we can harvest them if you're not planning to save their seed. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, salsify and potatoes, sweet potatoes, horseradish, beets, turnips, rutabagas, those are all going to be just fine without a pollinator. And actually most of our legumes, including peas and beans, don't really need much in the way of pollinators. I pared down my bean collection a few years ago, and that was my bean harvest from one day. I had 5 different varieties in that one container. Corn is another one that does not need pollinators. It's wind pollinated. So when you're planting corn, you actually do want to make sure that you plant them in a nice dense block because they get pollinated by pollen moving from that tassel to the next tassel, and the pollen doesn't travel necessarily along a nice dense or a nice concise row. Dense planting is going to be a really good bet for you. And onions and leeks are not going to need much of a pollinator either. All right, I'm actually right at the end of my talk. I thought I cut a little bit too little, but I guess I cut a little bit much, so we're near the end. So if you are planning to add pollinator attractive plants to your vegetable garden, you can definitely contact your local county extension office. The USDA plants database is a really good source of finding plants that are good for our area, as is Colorado Waterwise, Plant Select, High Country Gardens, and your local garden centers. It's usually best to avoid buying seeds from eBay or from Amazon because they are not really verified sellers and you don't necessarily know what you get. We, as an experiment a few years ago, bought some iris seed off of Amazon, and I think we counted like 5 different types of seed in the packet when we opened it out. Some of them were solanaceous, probably like something in the nightshade family. They looked like a tomato seed, but we're guessing they were probably a weed. So be sure that when you're buying seeds or buying plants, that you're buying them from a good and verified location. And if you're wanting some plans, Plant Select and Denver Water both have free plans available that you can get lists of plants and ideas on how to space them out in an aesthetic manner if you're like me and aren't very good at planning the aesthetic side of things. And then I just have some fun facts on our last page to kind of leave you with as if you have questions, I'm definitely happy to answer questions. And you can type those questions into the chat box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. I guess I covered everything. I guess everyone, I think Kristen is raising your hand. Kristen, can you type into the chat box? Or Eric, is the chat box? Oh, okay. I guess the chat was locked. You should be able to type now. Oh, good question, Michelle. Male versus female flowers. So if it depends on the plant. Some plants have female flowers and male flowers on the same plant, and some have the plants that are easiest to tell. Let me actually go back in my slideshow to the melons, or to, yeah, YouTube. So on the squash plants, it's the easiest to tell because there's a little baby fruit behind the flower. If it's a male flower, then there's just a smooth stem and then the flower. If it's a female, then it's gonna have this little baby fruit right behind the flower. The cucumber or the cucurbits are going to be the most useful crop for telling that. Most of the others, it's not terribly important to know whether or not, or to recognize the difference between the male and female. Or they might be perfect flowers, which means they have both male and female parts within them at the same simultaneously. Any other questions? Sorry, that was a little bit shorter. Usually I'm running over time, but I really cut down to try and make this, let people actually have some question time. Marilee says, if pollinator prefers perennials and woody plants, would a hardy pollinator garden of these plants keep them away from the veggies that need them? Pollinator, they'll go to any flower around. They will definitely, they'll hop around unless they are very, very species specific, which we do have some very species specific pollinators, but a lot of, like, our honeybees and our bumblebees and our syrphid flies are going to go to most of the flowers that are open and available. Kathy asking for a step-by-step process for pollinating. I don't have that, but I will make a note and try and make a step-by-step process to put up online. I might even, I'll try and make it, I mean, I don't have any flowers at the moment, but that's something I'll make a note of, and I'll try and have it up on our Facebook page, and I'll also try and put it on growandgivecolorado.org. I can't say that. Tips and tricks for intercropping specific kinds of flowers with specific vegetables to draw the right pollinators. Honestly, I mean, like I said, they're fairly, most of our heavy hitter pollinators are fairly indiscriminate. They're going to be attracted to the flowers. So if you have flowers in your yard, I doubt almost any of us have a yard that is bigger than 2 miles or bigger than a mile. And so if you've got flowers in your yard, then they're going to find your vegetable flowers as well. Is it okay to place new potting soil on previous year? It's best to start every year with new soil, definitely, just for hygiene purposes, or at the very least, if you planted vegetable crops in potting soil last year, plant pretty flowers in it this year, and then you can turn it into your garden or discard it the following year. All right, I am going to put my email address in the chat just in case anybody has further questions. And if you, I will try and get this uploaded onto our YouTube page and then get it captioned so that you can watch it later if you want to re-reference any of the material we talked about. And so, like I said, if you have questions, you can definitely shoot me an email. Or you can give us a call out on our Facebook page. And just so you know, we will be back next week. We will be repotting a lemon tree for our Facebook Live on Wednesday, and we will be talking about small fruits on Friday. If anyone has any other questions, I will hang out for a little bit.